Good morning to you all. My beautiful typography has disappeared in the transformation, so it's going to be Arial. Sorry, guys. When I proposed to Peter a Graybeard's panel session on the sort of history of books and browsers, he surprisingly accepted. And so I've been given the role of sort of quasi-historian, quasi-old coot. That presents the Graybeard problem, which is we had to validate HTML by hand going uphill both ways. That sort of thing. Also the waxing nostalgic. I'll try not to wax nostalgic too much because I'm really excited about what's going on and what I'm seeing here and the conversations that are happening. So I'm going to take sort of a even more than a 30,000-foot look. I'll be sort of taking it from the moon look at the past 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, depending on how it goes. I'll try to touch on the mindsets, the ways that we were thinking back then, and the parallels to how some of the questions are already being discussed this morning, which I think is pretty interesting. My entire career has been in scholarly nonprofit publishing, and it's worth saying that because that has informed an awful lot of the things that I've done over the last 20 years. I've been in nonprofit means profit is not really the goal. It's a necessary part of the mechanism, but disseminating is an equal partner in that. So there's always been this sort of balance between sustainability and dissemination. And that's what those are the problems that I've been working with all the way through. And nonprofit scholarly publishing has a mindset of pragmatism, of thrift, and of purpose. So that will be, from 83 to 89, I've been a typesetter from 81 to 89. I got into computers by being involved with typesetting. I had always said that I would never touch a computer because I was sure it would turn me binary and I'd lose my shades of gray. That was before color monitors. Anyway, I moved from computer typesetting to computer systems to database evangelist, saying we needed to have a database on that old land that we had there, the local area network, for those of you who have never heard the term, email evangelist. And did a bunch of CD-ROMs because we thought CD-ROMs were going to be really important. We turned some reference books into hypertext CD-ROMs, very complicated, really ugly, to put the process in, but then the internet came. I'm one of Gladwell's outliers. That little dot here in the middle of the country, is the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. And we were on the NSF backbone when it was really, really early. Yes, I'm not going to use the grandpa voice, but I put our publication database online for Telnet access. You could even search it as before that Gopher thing came along, but Gopher was nothing because in 1993 along came Mosaic. It had view source, which meant that I could see that HTML was just simplified typesetting codes, and I was enthralled. There had been a few attempts at books on floppy disks. Nothing really worked. For the most part, they were really cumbersome, didn't know where to sell them, they wouldn't be in bookstores because it was a computer thing and nobody who wanted to buy a CD-ROM would buy a book would go into a computer store. So different worlds. But here was HTML that let you put bold and italics and images on screen instantly. It was just astonishing. Still is pretty astonishing. This is what I was able to do first. Because I was online, I could download Mosaic. Because I'd been a typesetter, I had files on disks available to me that I could transform into HTML pretty darn quick. I'm pretty certain this is the first book I ever put in a browser, and probably among the first books ever put in a browser. I'm sure it was a Custer book, and I'm sure there's some metaphor there, but I'm not sure where it goes. And it might be in some floppy disk in my endless archives. But I was able to, it was really clear as I worked with it, that one long file wasn't the way to go. or even chapters at that point. They were too long, too bulky, nobody would ever read them all in one long sequence. And then I used a printed book to find page breaks, inserted them in, wrote a little bit of code to turn them into separate files, and designed a next page, previous page mechanism, and clapped my little hands together because look what I had done. And I took it to my director and I said, look what I've done. And the director said, yeah, well, how can we sell it? How could somebody own it? And how could we protect it? These are the essence of all the questions that we are talking about. There is no market for it, of course. I tried to make the argument that maybe it could be a good advertisement for the book itself. That was shot down quickly. Besides, there were only like 1 million people on the internet at that point, so it wasn't a big audience. Content protection, though, was all the rage because the library community and the universities did know that this stuff was coming. This is a period of all sorts of conferences trying to figure out what the internet was going to be. This is, I gave a talk at the Joint Harvard-MIT Technological Strategies for Protecting Intellectual Property in the Networked Multimedia Environment Conference in April of '93. And these were a couple of diagrams that I was thinking way outside the box, thinking, what would it be? And the one on the left is sort of the way books were sold currently. And the only free interaction was between a library and a publisher. And on the right was the strange new world of potential, where there might be a for-profit library or a public university library who was loaning things out. But if you look on the right-hand side, it says online bookstore. Couldn't even imagine that it was a real, air quotes. Some of the presentations at this conference were internet billing service design and prototype implementation, meta information, the network of the future, and intellectual property protection. A publishing and royalty model for the network documents that was given by Ted Nelson, who you may know coined hypertext as a term. So while there was a lot of presumptions built into this and into all of our things about stability and that we would take the old models and move them, that somehow it would all be the same but just glittery. And it also presumed that authors weren't going to be involved somehow, that there would still be the publisher as the intermediary. Yes, the term disintermediation was involved, but it wasn't like it was being talked about, but mostly publishers were scared, libraries were excited, but libraries were excited because they thought they would be the central pivot player in an awful lot of this stuff. And that's one of the themes that I see threading throughout is centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization. And that gets played out all over the place. Well, but the questions that we were asking ourselves, we're forced to ask ourselves, actually, were sort of what is a page? In fact, that was just discussed just earlier. What's a book? Discussed earlier. What is the saleable object? How can you make these things available? What are the standards? Because at that time there were very few. And what do we do with the linear narrative, the linear text in a hypertext environment? Round about that time, 1994, the National Academy Press, as it was called then, made I think 100 books available online for free, using this TIFF to GIF conversion that they had cobbled together. Started on page I, moved to page II, then you could push the button again and it would resolve and be III, and then IV. And then, so anyway, it was only linear, but they were certainly the first publisher to make their frontless books available online. The National Academy Press publishes for the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, the National Research Council, and the National Academy of Engineering. They publish about 200 books a year. They are kind of at the tippy top of the ivory tower. They're very sciencey. The reports that come out are the authoritative word on how much arsenic is allowable in drinking water, what should the national science education standards be, What about biofuels? What about climate change? Those kinds of questions. It was clumsy and awkward, and this was the interface, and it was 600 DPI scans sampled down to 72 DPI. It was because they had a Xerox Docutech machine that they could do this. It was utterly clumsy, but still my response and almost everybody else's response was, this is madness. You will go out of business right away because who would possibly buy a book if it was available for free online? Then in '95, I was at Hopkins for 2.5, almost 3 years, Johns Hopkins University Press, sort of leading the Project Muse as well as developing reference works in an online format, books and browsers. The Johns Hopkins Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism on the left still exists, but the intellectual property issues of all the pictures in Walker's Mammals of the World, the 2 volumes on the right, meant that that is no longer around. The Project Muse is a Mellon-funded enterprise, putting 40 journals up online. There's an awful lot of production issues involved. But mostly it was a matter of trying to devise business models. So we finally came up with a institutional subscription business model that, in the sense that a campus would, the IP range got access that nobody knew what their IP ranges were. They paid for the entire campus to get access to it. It's pretty fun for lots of people. Still exists and has hundreds of journals now. But it was based on this content scarcity model and the presumption of content value and the restriction of access as the model. And I once did a back of the envelope figuring of how much we were spending on all these things and realized we were spending more than half of our money, grant-funded money, preventing people from getting access to our books, which didn't quite seem right. So the questions going on at all the conferences were sort of, what are the other business models? What is ownership? What's the publisher's responsibility to readers? What is publishing? We got the Journal of Electronic Publishing came up about this time. There are lots of talks about appropriateness, or at least I was talking about appropriateness. In this case, this is from a 1998 article that as you can see, copyright. Anyway, content demands, personnel demands, publisher options, publishing purposes, the digital format itself, all these things had to be in the right balance to make an appropriate choice about how you're going to digitize these things. Then I was able, thank goodness, to move over to the National Academies Press in 1998. That's the start of the dot-com boom. And the entire staff, technical staff, and the director went off to dot-com land and then offered to sell their services back to the National Academies Press for a tidy sum. Well, the interim director, Barbara Klein Pope, who is now director and more, was a little consternated by that. Anyway, brought me in. And we were able to have a blank slate, pretty much, to see where we would go. We had 1,000 books, still in TIFF. We decided, well, by that time they had 4 years of experience with having their stuff online. And there was clear evidence that making books available online had increased sales, at least in some respects. This was the site at the time. Thank you, Wayback Machine. You were able to see this front, and then you'd go into that same interface that you saw before. So our questions were, do we build, or do we buy, or do we rent? How do we design, this is a really key question, to allow ourselves to do what was clear, which was that to respond to changes. We knew we were in a transition period, as we all know, we're in a transition period now. That we're not going to have, that anything we do is going to be adapted as we move forward. So how do we do that while retaining the authoritative stature of the institution? How do we design with flexibility in mind? And yes, we could think about SGML, we could think about some of those sort of things, but we also had other questions. How do we build a commerce site? How do we code the production systems? What about metadata? How do we get everybody involved? What about navigation, findability? How do we deal with scale? Because we were crossing a threshold at that point. And this is sort of my little list of what I think is the case. 10 is a list, 100 requires categorization, 1,000 things require search, more than 2,000 things requires something more than search, discovery. Millions requires Google, of course. But we're crossing that 1,000 range. So over the next while, we got some OCR software. I managed to hire this brilliant guy named Mark Grisky, who is still with us, who was a self-taught sort of systems maker, tied all these things together. We see if this, I hope this works. Oh, it does, or maybe it will. Good, it did. This is a presentation I gave in 2001 to IFLA, and it means that I can show you a page. So this is what it looked like in 2001. There's a relatively readable version of the page itself. A table of contents there. Previous page, previous chapter, next chapter. Search all text. Search this book. Search this chapter. The basics of it are sort of the basics that you will always have for a linear text. But by making it available this way, we were also at a threshold point trying to figure out whether we were making it too good, because we had to be self-sustainable too. We had to make all this stuff happen while still selling books. The balance was much more clear with the National Academies because they are a science organization. The scientists were saying, we want to make this stuff free. We want to make it all available. And then we'd say, well, sure, give us $6 million and we will be able to, a year going forward, and we'll be able to do that. Nah, we're not quite ready for that. But we're trying to push the boundaries of accessibility and utility while still retaining salability of the printed book, the real thing. So at this point, we're getting about 400,000 visitors a month, which was a lot at the time, still is a lot. And so we've gotten it up to that point. Sort of now what? Well, of course, to make the pages HTML instead of page images. But the questions were how questions. They weren't sort of what is how and what. Keep bouncing back and forth. How can we do more? How can we improve it? So this is actually yesterday, but by about 2006 to today, this is pretty much what it's been like, and I will go ahead and do it. Yes, I do have enough time for the demo. Good. So while we now get 1 million to 1.5 million visitors a month, we recognized that we had to develop different search engines. I had built a semantic extraction engine in 2000, thinking I might go .com too, which was using semantic cues as well as frequency, as well as those sorts of things to extract search key terms from documents. But we also wanted to make sure our search paid attention to recency, significance, some of the other things. We're using almost exclusively open source tools. But because we had these things, we were able to build a skim tool which extracts for every page the most significant chunk from that page in terms of the chapter's overall array of key terms that are over here, for example. So I can also home in on cellulosic biofuel and see the chunks in this chapter that have that term. We built a little web search builder. to allow somebody to use these things, bioenergy feedstock. I can add that, I can go off and do a search of that on the web. That is, our books would become tools for exploring the rest of the world. These advanced tools seemed pretty cool to us. We added a reference finder where you drop in the report you're writing for class and then hit go, and it'll show you the reports that tie in to your content by doing massive matching. All these things were useful and teaching us things because we had the scale of lots of people coming to our site to see what it is we're doing. So from about that point to today, the questions are partly what and how. What is the mission that we're fully trying to accomplish? How do we continue to achieve it? And one of the ways in which we have done that is over that period, we've been trying to whittle down and simplify and hyper-efficiency our stuff so that we can give away even more. In 2006, we started making our small market publications available for free in PDF to anybody. Earlier, we had made it free to anybody in a developing country. In fact, any of our publications were free to the developing country because that was part of our mission. And we were mission-driven publishing in a particularly important way. And the browser was the way in which we were able to implement that mission by helping anybody get access to our reports all over the world. In June of this year, we made PDFs of everything we publish available, and EPUB too, from our site. We don't have everything in EPUB yet, but if we have it in EPUB, we will make it available for free. Because we were able to whittle ourselves down to a small enough footprint to be able to be supported by the institution, to be able to do some maneuvering with the way that internal funding worked. In the process of all this, we no doubt crossed that threshold of making the book online better than or sufficient to replace the print book. So in terms of this whole trajectory of books in browsers, the move from scarcity to abundance, the move from the object to a potentially hypertextual object. Some of the lessons are that scale matters, no question. One book is just a drop in the ocean. We happen to have a glass of water. Standards matter. But mission matters hugely. Mission should be driving the choices that you make internally regarding the strategic choices that your company is moving forward with, your publishing enterprise is moving forward with. Openness matters a lot. Free is a very special price, as my boss says. And the more you can give away, the more likely you are to get audience, and the more likely you are to be able to have an audience to sell to. I used to talk about the best non-optimal version of a book being the thing that you should put up online. Because if it's not quite optimal, then, well, is that Kevin Kelly over there? Yes. So your 1,000 true fans will buy your book because they'll find it because the non-optimal version is there, and they want the optimal version, the best version. Quality matters a ton as well. And this is an interesting one, I think, to me. Complexity is desirable only to maybe like the 5% of the population that we represent. Nobody likes complexity. On our site, people come from Google, they read, we have great stats. I mean, we have, people will spend, the average is 20 minutes per visitor on our site. The average reader reads 8 pages plus. So we have a deep engagement, but 5% of our audience uses site search. 0.3% use related, even goes to the list of related titles. And about 1% of those searchers, so 0.1%, 0.5%, use the research, any of those research tools. Once they use them, they come back to them and use them again, it seems. But over the last couple of years, that number has even decreased further. We used to have 1.4% using the research tools. So those are kind of odd realities, but it's necessary to say that you shouldn't overburden your reader with complexity. We all would know that sort of instinctively, but it's not worth spending 90% of your energy on something that only 5% of your audience will want. More lessons here. What is possible will generally exceed what audiences can accept. Within the sort of browser, JavaScript, et cetera, we often did things that would just confuse people because they didn't think a book should do that. And that's part of the issues. We've certainly morphed our business models, and don't bet your farm on a business model, but rather presume that business models will morph, because they certainly have morphed over this period I'm talking about. And the cultural models and the metaphors themselves, meaning, we had that metaphor of the desktop, of folders, of these things that are physical objects. Those are beginning to morph. We now think of them not just as files, but as sort of objects. But those things morph more slowly than business models, and much more slowly than the technology that makes these things possible. And finally, how is transitory? What, that is, how do we do something? What, that is, what is a book? What is a document? What is an object to sell? That's less transitory, but the how and the what sort of dance around each other as things move along the trajectory of time and advancement. And really the key is to identify the why. Why are you doing this? Why are you applying it to this particular issue, this particular book, this particular presentation, so that the authors can thrive and we can all benefit? And that's all for me. Thank you.